Tell your children not to look my way. Tell your children not to hear my words. What they mean, what they say. Mother, mother, can you keep them in the dark for a while? Can you hide them from the wedding world? Oh, no. Father, gonna take you down tonight. Gonna show her my world. Oh, Father.
Better chill out there, heavy metal dick.
Has this ever happened to you? You're listening to your favorite, vaguely fascistic porno grind record. That wasn't an abrupt cutoff, by the way, that was the entire song. But then you get a little bit later into the album and, it still sounds like the Meat Shits, because it's the Meat Shits. It's very chaotic and vaguely thrashy. It's got all the spooky samples, but it's a bit more complex than they usually are, and then this happens. What was this weird, bass transition into
I'm gonna break your arms, my friend. I'm gonna love breaking your fucking arms.
네, 최근에 나온 박진영 제가 굉장히 팬인데요.
There's keyboards, there's slow doomy riffs. I thought I was listening to the Meat Shits, and all of a sudden, it's some weird variety of, fucking doom death.
안녕, 나는 총무부장이야.
You're darn right, because in the mid-90s, the backing band for the Meat Shits was in fact the old school, amazing death metal band, Infester. Now this is probably one of my favorite death metal bands. I would go on to say that they're objectively one of the most complex and interesting bands to attempt the genre of all time. But a lot of times when you talk about this band, the cold take you get from the old heads is, weren't those guys just the Meat Shits?
Sub-Zero.
Very cold take. These guys have been ignored for years because their association with the Meat Shits, who are a very fun grindcore band, much in the vein of Anal Cunt, only less satirical and quite a bit more hateful, if that's even believable, but still very vulgar and crass. So they got that monkey on their back, and then also they might have had some bad optic symbols in some of their promo photos, if you know what I'm saying. And their album came out on Moribund, who are a little bit more well-known nowadays as a black metal label. And it's been out of print intermittently for the past 20 years. So, not as well-known as they should be. Just on an aesthetic level, you could probably compare them to the similarly underrecognized Morpheus Descends, who were from the opposite coast of the US. That was an old New York death metal band. You can see the members of Suffocation wearing old Morpheus shirts. Infester was from the Pacific Northwest, which also might explain why they're not as well known, given that that wasn't really a terribly vibrant death metal scene compared to New York and Tampa. So they kind of sound like Morpheus Descends in terms of aesthetics, very dry, cavernous production, creepy riffs. But sonically, I would actually say, if early Therion isn't the Burzum of death metal, then Infester definitely is. So here we have
이번에 처음으로 우리 트와이스 멤버들 다 같이 여행하는 거죠.
Yeah, I know. We're listening to Burzum right now, not Infester. I'm going somewhere with this. So this is Burzum. We have a very simple two-chord riff, and then a bit of a weird dissonant drone over it. Not very tuneful or intellectual at all. But then it starts to transition from that super simple primordial ingredient into something quite a bit more atmospheric and, how would you say, high-minded. As the tempo starts to slow in the guitar riffs, if not necessarily the drums. Sorry, this part takes a bit to get to. You need to hear this entire transition to understand where I'm going with this. There we go. So within 30 seconds, we went from to this weird, like, keyboard-heavy waltz. Well, Infester, despite being a death metal band, we're on a very similar trip. Same sort of mental space. We have this super simple, dissonant two-chord riff, then a bit of a New York-style jumping around brutal death metal riffs. Back into that droning two-chord elemental primordial caveman riff, very similar to that Burzum one. And it performs the same sort of compare-contrast trick that Burzum did. See, right there. Now, maybe sonically it's not that similar to Burzum, but in terms of compositional intent, I would say that is absolutely on the same wavelength. And actually, the drummer from this band, kind of the only guy who's done other musical stuff outside of the other guys doing the meat shit stuff, went on to found a rather well-known and very Burzum-influenced black metal band called Chrome in the early 2000s. So maybe Infester were like some of the first American Burzum fans? I don't know, they were on Moribund, so they were in contact with some black metal people. But like many American death metal bands, they took quite a bit of influence from the more technical speed and thrash metal bands that their compatriots were putting out material with in the 80s. Do you happen to have an example of a decent percussive thrash riff in the library there?
우리 동아리 실세는 바로
Oh man, is that atrophy? I like the way you party. But yeah, this kind of riff, very good stuff, and very influential in a lot of American death metal bands. Infester, of course, being one of them. Very similar sounding riff to that little atrophy breakdown, but it's all down-tuned, and the drums are quite a bit more adventurous, which lets you know that they've progressed beyond simple death thrash into death metal. Also, there are some absolutely nasty fucking breakdowns on this album. And they're done in a very strange sort of atmospheric way. It's like if Burzum turned into a beat-down hardcore band. They're super spooky and dark and thuggish, but also intellectual at the same time. In fact, I think right now might be a good time to do a little montage of some of the best creepy, spooky, haunted house-ass fucking breakdowns on this album. So we have keyboard drones, cavernous, rattling cymbals, and an expert use of sonic layering. And then this completely knuckle-dragging breakdown riff, of which I'm a major fan. Fucking spooky stuff.
Boom! Haunted house!
Interesting sound layering here. We just have that slight cymbal click, very horror movie-esque with the minimalist keyboards. And that simple repetitive riff building an atmosphere. Slightly start adding in some more complex drumming as the vocals come in. The shrieks and growls in this album were excellent. I like the variety of vocalizations utilized. Climaxing in this nasty twisting and turning cavernous breakdown riff. Very good stuff.
Boom! Haunted house!
There's a lot of gnarly tempo changes on this album. Like, this is kind of a breakdown. And then it goes into almost a straight-up grindcore riff without missing a beat. Then this shuffling, nasty thrash break. And a bass breakdown.
How neat is that? That's pretty neat.
The drummer for this album, Dario, is an Italian gent. He also plays all the keyboards, so with those spooky keyboards and the fact that there's prominent samples from Suspiria on this album, I would say that all those Giallo movies probably had a heavy influence on the atmospherics of this particular work. I really like how he has this like slow riff. He's doing that really fast, like kind of double bass thing under it. Very unique. So he's been in a shitload of bands, probably most notably his black metal solo project Chrome, KROHM, which are quite good. And also he was in Drawn and Quartered, who were the other preeminent Northwestern death metal act from the 90s. Unfortunately, Jason Oliver and Todd Stevenson, the bassist and the guitarist, or rather the guitarist and the bassist, I said them in the wrong order.
Wow.
They don't appear to have had any other artistic endeavors apart from being in the meat shits, which is unfortunate because I think there were some very technically gifted musicians and composers if this album is anything to go by. This album's intermittently hard to get. Like, when I first got it, I got this really weird order from Moribund Records where they only gave me the CD and then like a Xerox of like the album cover. The CD was like actually from the 90s. It was so strange. Very cheap though. But it's up on Moribund's Records Bandcamp now. And then Cruciator Records from France also have it up on their Bandcamp with the pre-album demo included. And you can do that thing where you buy the CD off the Bandcamp and you get the MP3s for free. I like that. Everybody should do that. Why doesn't everybody do that? I don't have time to wait for stuff. Well, I guess everybody has lots of time to wait for stuff now because we're all dying of bad AIDS. But it's well worth checking out, and it's easier to get now than it ever has been in the past, so I would highly recommend picking this up. And with that, I bid you adieu.
See ya. That's it. Bye-bye.